chapter 11 is titled Cell Communication. In this chapter, we're going to take a closer look at how cells can send messages to each other so they can communicate. Now, very frequently, the types of messages that cells will send to each other are in the form of chemical signals. Cells have the ability to respond to chemical signals sent from other cells, but also chemicals that might perchance be found in the environment as well. The types of signaling pathways that we're going to take a closer look at in this chapter are examples. There are a wide plethora of different kinds of signaling pathways that living organisms use between cells to allow those cells to communicate. But keep in mind that while there is a diverse array of these signaling pathways, typically nature doesn't like to reinvent the wheel. So if a particular type of signaling pathway really works well for an organism, you might see that type of signaling pathway appear in multiple organisms that are somehow related by a common ancestor, right? If it works, why change it? And so oftentimes natural selection will hold on to these common signaling pathways. As we anticipate looking at different signaling pathways, really cellular signaling or cellular messaging occurs in three main steps. So we're going to take a look closely at these three steps. They include signal reception, so receiving the message. Signal transduction, how do you get the message actually into the inside of the cell to where that message is going to enact some sort of cellular response, which is the third step. This is the outcome, right? What was the whole point that signal wanted to get across to the next cell? But before we can do that, let's just take a couple steps back and take a look at the different kinds of signaling that you might encounter in a multicellular organism. So two different types. You can have local signaling or you can have long distance signaling. These days, when you're calling your friend on a cell phone, you don't really have to worry about local versus long distance calling. But back in the day, when we most commonly used landlines, you had to worry about are you making a local call, which oftentimes was cheaper, or are you making a long distance call, which sometimes was much more expensive. So kind of the same idea here. Local signaling would be calling somebody maybe in your neighborhood or within your town. And then long distance signaling, you might be calling somebody in a different state, in a different country, for example. So there are three different types of local signaling: direct, paracrine, and synaptic. We will take a look at all three of those, and then only one kind of long distance signaling, which we call endocrine signaling, and we'll also take a look at that one. So local signaling first. Direct signaling. As the name implies, this involves direct contact between adjacent or neighboring cells. This is not something that is new to us. In Chapter 6, we took a look at different types of cellular junctions, both in animal and plant cells, and the gap junction in animal cells and the plasmodesmata in plant cells. These are great examples of direct signaling between neighboring cells. So just a quick refresher, remember gap junctions in animal cells, this is where a set of proteins creates a pore or a channel between adjacent cells where the cells can exchange fluid and really small dissolved particles in that cytoplasm. And then plasmodesmata, same concept, except in plant cells. And this is where the plasma membrane of one plant cell is continuous with the plasma membrane of the adjacent plant cell, again, creating a sort of channel or a tube that allows these two neighboring cells to exchange their cytosol, right? So liquid along with any really small dissolved particles in that liquid. On top of that, you might also have cell-to-cell communication that's direct signaling where nothing is exchanged from the inside of one cell to the inside of the next cell, but instead you have molecular components that are embedded in the membrane, on the surface of their membranes, that interact with each other. And so this example down here is what we would call cell-to-cell recognition. In green, remember, in your textbooks, typically this shows carbohydrates, and then proteins are shown in purple. So in this case, you have the first cell that is decorated with these green carbohydrates. We talk about how carbohydrates are frequently like a uniform that will dress a cell so that any other cell that's going to interact with the first cell has the ability to recognize what cell type it is simply by reading those carbohydrates. And that's exactly what you see here. So the purple protein on the second cell is interacting with the carbohydrate in the first cell, and that tells the inside of the second cell something about the cell that it's interacting with. That can very frequently be used by your immune system. Again, your immune system needs to be able to tell the difference between a self cell and a non-self cell, right? You want your immune system to leave your body cells alone and only attack those cells that are invaders and could potentially harm you. So that's direct signaling. You literally have to have physical contact between the adjacent cells to get that signaling across. You can also have local signaling, so over a very short distance where one cell doesn't necessarily directly contact its neighbor, but instead sends a molecular signal, so a chemical signal over that short distance. And so one example of this is paracrine signaling. This frequently will happen with animal cells where you have one cell type that's going to be the secreting cell. So you can see the secreting cell here that will use its endomembrane system to create a whole bunch of those secretory vesicles that contain the signaling molecule, and then probably in response to some sort of stimulus, the secreting cell will allow those secretory vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane, dumping the signaling molecule into that extracellular space. And then the nearby target cells that aren't too far off, very likely in the same tissue, will have receptors and be able to pick up those signaling molecules and then respond to them. So paracrine signaling is this release of a signaling molecule from one cell that travels a very short distance and targets another cell close by. And then synaptic signaling is kind of the same concept, but it will happen only in a very specific cell type. So synaptic signaling, you will have this type of signaling in your nervous system where one neuron, the way that it passes its message to the next neuron is through the use of synaptic signaling. Or you might have a neuron contacting a gland or a muscle cell. And this way, using synaptic signaling, the nerve cell can transmit its signal to the gland cell or the muscle cell, causing it to maybe release a hormone or allow the muscle cell to contract. In the case of synaptic signaling, the signaling molecule is very specifically called a neurotransmitter because it is released from a nerve cell or a neuron, and then it will, that neurotransmitter will traverse what we call the synapse, which is that gap between either adjacent neurons or the neuron and, let's say, the muscle cell. The neurotransmitter will go across that synaptic cleft or that gap and then reach the target cell, and the target cell will have receptors that will have the ability to interact with the neurotransmitter and elicit a response in that target cell. So we'll get a chance to take a little bit of a closer look at this, especially when we talk about what kinds of receptors are found on that target cell. And then long-distance signaling. So long-distance signaling is called endocrine signaling. This has everything to do with hormones. Both plants and animals use chemicals as part of endocrine signaling as their messages, and specifically, we call these guys hormones. Endocrine signaling is very similar to paracrine signaling, except for the distance. So think paracrine signaling, short distance that the signaling molecule has to travel, and then endocrine, it's long distance. So you're expecting the vasculature to carry this hormone to a completely different part of the organism where it'll find its target cell. The hormones that are used as these signaling molecules as part of endocrine signaling are released by very specialized cells. So, for example, it might be a gland, it might be an organ like the pancreas that's going to produce insulin, which is one example of a hormone. The insulin that's produced by your pancreas, the pancreas doesn't respond to it, but your muscle cells and your liver cells do. So the only way that the insulin is going to get to those cells is via your bloodstream. So the endocrine cell in your pancreas will produce the insulin. It'll make its way to the capillaries, which will pick it up, and then send it through the rest of your body via the blood vessels, and then eventually target the cell that it needs to target, like your muscle cell or your liver cell, encouraging it to take up that extra blood glucose that's floating around in your bloodstream. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that for endocrine signaling, like your pancreas producing insulin, that insulin goes everywhere in your body via the blood. It'll go to all of the tissues, but only very specific tissues have the ability to respond to it, because it's only those tissues or only those cells that produce the receptor that can interact with the insulin. So for example, your muscle cells, your liver cells, they will produce that insulin receptor, and that gives those cells the ability then, when the insulin bumps into them, to interact with the insulin and receive the message that the insulin is trying to send.